Peak. A peak is one of those words that can have a number of meanings, but essentially it means a high point. It can be the top of a mountain off in the distance, but it can also be a measure of success, like the peak of your career, or performance, that they were operating at peak and optimal performance. It can also be the highest level, such as the peak of the flu season, where things are seeming to condense and congeal around a particular time. And peak can have sort of an action meaning to it, as well as in don't peak too soon, or even be descriptive as peak productivity. All sorts of meanings, but ultimately being at that point, that zenith, that summit is a peak. And as we read our text today from the book of Isaiah, it begins with God casting a vision situated on a peak. In the last days, it reads, the mountain where the temple stands will be the highest one of all, towering above all the hills. Many nations will come streaming to it, and their people will say, let us go up to the hill of the Lord, to the temple of Israel's God. He will teach us what he wants us to do. We will walk in the paths he has chosen. For the Lord's teaching comes from Jerusalem. From Zion, he speaks to his people. And you know, when you read the book of Isaiah, one of the longest books in the Bible, because it went over such a long period of time in the life of the children of Israel, there are actually two beginnings. The first chapter is the beginning, and it's really speaking of God's condemnation and judgment on the people for their disobedience and their turning away from God. But then here we are in chapter 2, and it's also an introduction into this text, and it presents a very different sort of message. It's one of a vision filled with hope. And perhaps we can begin to imagine, if we put ourselves in the mindset of the people at that time, that over the centuries they had been in a lot of valleys. They had been in a lot of situations where they'd been in captivity, where they had to deal with conquering nations around them, where they lived in exile, where the things that they had built up had been torn down, where they were constantly under threat of invasion or takeover. And this text, as we're reading it, comes more than half a millennium before Jesus comes. And they're listening now to the prophet Isaiah present this dream, this vision of God's intentions. But they look around them, and at that time, in their beautiful, or once beautiful, city of Jerusalem, is in shambles. It's been destroyed. The temple that text talks about is in ruins. And yet at that time, they still cling to the hope and put their trust in the one who is more powerful than any empire coming to conquer them, or any destructive force looking to tear them down. This passage we read today is a recitation of God's promise of a world very different from the world that they could see around them. But nevertheless, God continues to paint this picture of peace. Not just the absence of war, but a transformation of the tools of discord and disputes into the tools of planting and harvesting. He will settle disputes among great nations, it says. They will hammer their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Everything will be just as God intended it to be. That's the vision that God is casting before them. And the encouragement to the people at the end of all of that is to walk in the light which God gives us. We need God's light for our journey. And as I was considering this text, and as this light is blinding me right now, if I can confess, God will illustrate in many ways. As I was thinking about this text, I was reminded of a trip I took over 20 years ago. I went to Hawaii. I was on the island of Maui, and with my sister, and we were planning to go to the top of this crater. Now, most people would go on the tours, and the tours would take you so that you could see the sunrise. Now, I'm not a morning person, and that 6-hour time difference was really messing with me. So I suggested to my sister, so why don't we do something different? We'll see the sun set. She was agreeable, so we had to rental cars because there weren't tours taking up at that time. And so we were driving up, and we decided that she would drive up and I would drive down. Well, as we're driving up, and we're going through town and everything's fine, but as we start to drive up around this crater, which is a volcano, it's been dormant for 200 years, but still it's a volcano. And so we're driving up, and I don't know if you've ever driven on a road where you're going up and there are no guardrails on the side, and the road is narrow, and I'm sitting on the passenger side, and so we're right on the edge, and I'm looking down, and all I can see is down. There's no, and I'm looking and noticing after a while that there aren't any lights on this path, on this road, like not one. And there aren't even the little reflectors that normally you have in the road, none of that. And so I'm anticipating that we're going to go up there, we're going to see the sun set, which means it's going to be completely dark coming down. And I'm not a nervous driver, but I start to get a little nervous. Because at the same time, there are other cars coming down that are just flying. They are, now my sister is a very sort of responsible driver, so she's driving, at a reasonable pace. But that's not what's happening. So there are these cars, and they're whizzing by us. And all I can think of is what it's going to be like to drive down. And so then I started thinking, how am I going to convince her not to stay for the sunset? That we can just go out, take a look, and come down, so maybe the sun will still be providing some light as we're going down. So we get up to the top of this crater, and there's an observation deck, and I'm looking out, and it's absolutely gorgeous. The crater itself is gorgeous, because there are all these colors from all the years of the volcano eruptions that have long since happened, but have left this beautiful swirl of colors. So you think of the colors of fall. Those colors were sort of embedded into this crater, the oranges and reds and yellows, and there was life on this because it hadn't had an eruption so long. So there were green, there were trees, and it was lush. And it was all the same, so even the barren parts had the beautiful colors, but of surrounding that with all this lush greenery, and it's absolutely breathtaking. And it's 10,000 feet above sea level, so the air is pretty thin, so it really was breathtaking, but it was also visually breathtaking. It's beautiful. Actually above the clouds, so looking down, and you can see the clouds, and see the sky and the sun, and it was just amazing. But at the same time, I'm thinking, let's go, so we can get down while the sun is still up. So I say to her, I said, well, I know we said we're going to stay for the sunset, but what are you thinking before I can finish the sunset? She's like, okay, let's go. So we go, and I'm driving down, and I'm driving down, I realize that now I'm hugging the mountain. It's much safer, now it's still getting dark, but I'm hugging the mountain, I wasn't going to be on the edge. And as we get down, we hit town, just as the sun is setting, and then the lights of town illuminate the way. And it was a harrowing trip going up, and a little bit, because there still were other cars zipping through, and it still was a steep climb going down. But as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about how much more I would have enjoyed the experience if I hadn't anticipated what was going to happen on the way down. Now, the crater, Mount Haleakala, which means House of the Sun in Hawaiian, is a tourist attraction that, virtually anyone who goes to Maui, you're going to go on that, the tallest peak in all the Hawaiian islands, I believe. And the Hawaiian Islands, though, were created out of mountains just like that. Every island was created like that, from these shifts in the Earth's crust that create these divisions and these movements. And this beautiful experience happened because we were on a place that was created out of seismic shifts. Mountains are formed by movements of the Earth's crust. Sometimes they're folded, sometimes they buckle, sometimes they break in huge blocks. Sometimes it's the Earth's crust rising up into a dome, or like this one, by volcanic activity. where the lava just flows and eventually hardens and becomes something wonderful over time. But the reality that I found is that peaks don't just happen. Something has to cause them. It takes something to get there, and it takes something to be formed and to maintain. And so even though I had that incredible glimpse into heaven, and even though I couldn't fully enjoy it because I was so worried about the journey down, I have to realize that over time I realized this lesson that when you're on the top, you have to take the time to enjoy it. Those mountaintop experiences don't happen nearly enough, and it takes too much effort to get there, to savor the moment. We have to climb up the mountain, but the mountain has to be created. And eventually, yes, we have to come down. And the thing about peaks is that you can't move from one directly to another. Wouldn't it be nice if you could go from one peak to another peak to another peak? You know, the Bible talks about people going from strength to strength, but never anywhere does it say you'll go from one mountaintop to another, because that's not how they're formed. The way they're formed is you have to climb to get up to the top, and once your time there is over, you have to travel down into the valley. And sometimes we think the valley is a punishment, or it's a correction, or we've done something wrong, or we've lost our way, but the truth is that the valley is always part of that journey. It'd be nice to go from peak to peak, but that's not the way it works. And so when we find ourselves in the valley, we should not think that's our destination. I think that's our natural inclination, is think when we're down low that this is where we're supposed to be. This is our natural place where we belong, that it's home. But the valley is actually the base of the mountain. And so we need to recondition ourselves and reorient our thinking so that we're in the valley when life is especially hard, when we're not in a good place, when there's more shadow than light, that we're not where we're supposed to be, but we're on our way to the next peak. But in order to get there, we have to go through something. When the psalmist says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he wasn't talking about the end of his life. He wasn't talking about the times in his life when he was in trouble, or life was uncertain, or there was danger or peril all around him. Or even when he was navigating through those things. He was talking about the fact that when he was navigating and going through those things, that God was with him. We don't walk alone. We walk with God. And whether we're at the top of that mountain and we can see the magnificent splendor of God at work in our world, or we're in the valley where we might not be able to see anything beyond our next step, God is with us. When I was on Mount Harlaka, I worried about the sun setting and the light disappearing. But the truth is that the true light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And there I was, rushing from the majesty of God displayed at the zenith to find the temporary security of artificial light in the valley. But God doesn't come from the valley. God comes from Zion, the top, meeting us where we are to take us where God is. And that's what Advent is about. That's what the Word made flesh is about. God coming to where we are so that we can be where God is. And Mount Zion has a meaning. It's not just a place. Reverend Sadler, who preached my installation, his nephew is a tremendous, brilliant biblical scholar, Old Testament in particular. So one day he asked him, well, what does Mount Zion mean? You know, what did it mean to the people of Israel? What does it mean in the Hebrew life? And he said, Mount Zion, which is the same as Zion, it's an earthly manifestation of a heavenly reality on earth as it is in heaven, just like we pray each week. That's what we wait for. That's what we get a glimpse of during those mountaintop experiences we have from time to time. We're on our way, day by day, moment by moment, overcoming the challenges, facing the tough realities, confronting the difficult choices. Remember that we're on our way to the next peak. Don't give up when you're in the valley. When you reach the bottom, that just means it's time to start climbing again. Start ascending again. Start lifting up your bowed down head again, because your peak awaits and it's coming from Zion. Amen? Amen.